The village of Fritchley is a small, picturesque hamlet south of Critch. Fritchley is a very proud place, and many members of the community have lived there all their lives, just like their parents and grandparents. The majority of the buildings in the village were once owned by the founding members of a branch of Quakers and set up a meeting place for Sunday worship. The tradition still goes strong today, with many of the original members' descendants still in attendance. But in 2012, the village was thrust into the headlines as a team of archaeologists were given a grant to excavate a piece of the village's long-forgotten past. For laying underneath a road junction covered with nearly half a century of wall and soil was the oldest surviving railway tunnel ever constructed. Apart from being famous for its community, Fritchley was also well known for its limestone and sits on a rich limestone deposit. Limestone has been mined in the area for centuries, even going as far back as the Roman period. But in the 1790s, famous civil engineer Benjamin Outram and his friend Francis Beresford saw a golden opportunity. There was land available to buy near the village of Critch, and having owned an ironworks together at Butterley, they saw it as a cheap way to supply it with the limestone it needed. But like many quarries, getting the stone out was only half the battle. It was getting the limestone to the ironworks that was the tricky part. After the land was acquired, a new tramway was built ready to take the limestone from the quarry to the Cromford Canal. Granted, most likely in 1789, the line would be the first ever railway line Outram would produce and was set as an unusual gauge of 3 foot 6 inches. It was a mix of horse and gravity drawn, and the rails were cast in an L shape so it would guide the wheels of the wagons, and the line sat on stone sleepers that were inlaid into the trackbed itself, negating the need for ballast. But when the line reached Fritchley, the line had to go under a road junction. There was no way Outram or anyone else could go about it, so a tunnel was built under the road for the line to pass through. The tunnel wasn't long, about 28 metres, if that, but it was carefully constructed and brick-lined for strength. As the tunnel was so short and the weight above it not that great, the tunnel was built using the cut and cover method. A trench was dug down to where the trackbed would be, then a brick wall of sandstone was built up on either side. They would have used a former, a structure to help support the arched roof as it was built, then the former was removed once the arched roof was completed. Once done, the structure was buried in the earth and the road restored. The new line was christened the Butterley Gangway, and we know from historical records that the line was operational and working well by 1793. The quarry and the line was working well into the 1800s, but as horse gave way to steam, it was theorised that the Butterley Gangway could do with an upgrade as well. Steam engines never got tired, they never slept, and they didn't need the same amount of care and attention as horsepower. But horses still excelled in one thing: hills. These new engines were fantastic, but they lacked power. The new rack and pinion was designed for hill climbing, given the engine's constraints, but no one wanted to replace their entire line to accommodate, especially when Robert Stephenson and William Hedley's experiments on steel railed adhesion had proved promising. Mechanical engineer William Brunton was excited at these results. He was born to be an engineer and studied anything that ticked or had a piston. His family encouraged it too, having come from mechanical backgrounds themselves. Although the experiments suggested that modern engines could only cope with a 1% incline, Brunton wanted to push this further, literally. In 1808 he was employed at the Butterley Works, where he met many famous engineers. It was here he was able to discuss and even build his new engine. The engine was different, to say the least. The idea was simple. It had a boiler and 2 cylinders, but instead of the cylinders powering the motion on the wheels, the cylinder powered 2 legs at the back. The legs would grip the ground and push the locomotive forward. It was hoped that this unusual source of locomotion would be the best solution for tackling the pesky gradients, as the rail adhesion conundrum would not come into the equation. Brunton wanted to try his ideas, and what better place than the Butterley Gangway? The gangway was hilly, and it would truly put the locomotive to the test. It cost £240 to build, but it was ready. It was slower than the horses and would only walk about 3 miles an hour, but amazingly, it worked. The crews called the engine the Steam Horse, and it's not known how long it worked for or what happened to it. But we do know a second one was built in 1815, which sported a larger boiler and worked in a colliery in the northeast. However, on the 31st of July 1815, during a test, the boiler exploded, killing 13 spectators who had come to watch the engine in action. It was thought that the explosion was caused by a tampered safety valve. Drivers would sometimes screw or tie down safety valves, as they were sometimes deemed too sensitive and would open prematurely. It was thought that the screwing down of the valve would stop this from happening. However, it prevented the valves from doing their jobs. The incident was recorded officially as the first railway disaster. The Iron Horse was the first steam engine to run in the East Midlands, but it opened the door for more steam engines. Around the same time, the quarry at Critch was becoming harder to mine. More focus was being put on the new quarry at Hilts, and a new branch line spurring off west of the main line was built to serve it. The old mine would dry up in the 1860s and the rails taken up shortly afterwards. But in the 1840s, a new railway line built by the North Midland Railway opened in close proximity to the Butterley Gangway. The railway saw potential in the small line and wanted to link up with it. It also proposed a way to make the line more economical and easier to run the engines by rerouting the line and making the line run straighter. The plan ultimately failed thanks to the railway bubbles bursting and Hudson running for the hills, but the gangway did take some of the Midlands ideas on board. It updated the line to accommodate the narrow gauge track, and it followed the majority of the Midlands plan. The southern end of the tunnel was rebuilt, and a new entrance was built that was slightly to the west of the original, and the L-shaped tracks were also removed in favour of traditional iron rails. Overall, it took the railway from a small venture to a real substantial enterprise. The line was now able to take on more stone than it had ever done before, and the foundry at Butterley had extended its line works at Bull Bridge. It was estimated that over 30,000 tonnes of stone would pass through, as well as 8,000 tonnes of processed lime. The realignment was mostly completed by the 1870s, and with it came steam engines. These engines were much more powerful than the Iron Horse and were locally known as coffee pots. The Chaplin engines were made especially for the quarry, shunting and mine work. Maintenance was easier than standard locomotives, as the boiler can simply be unbolted and lifted off by a crane and a new one fitted. Their short wheelbase were perfect for tight turns, and they came in a range of gauges. It was said that the coffee pot worked the gangway. However, it had to be modified and have part of its chimney removed, as it regularly caught one of the bridges on the line. By 1893, there was a new director of the foundry and a new vision. John Hamilton wanted to improve equipment and operating methods, and started by bringing a new engine to the line. This was Bagnall's wing tank locomotive with a 040 wheel arrangement. It was number 1435 and was named Fitz. Due to its extra power, it was able to go up the inclines where the coffee pots were still relying on ropes to help them. The more powerful engine also brought new wagons, which could hold up to 3 tons each, and Fitz was often seen pulling up to 16 of these in a single train 3 to 4 times a day. It was needed too, as the quarry had just been given permission to extend. A temporary tramway was built to the old quarry site so that any waste from the new quarry could be dumped there. However, through fear that Hilts Quarry was going to go dry, the decision was made to reopen the old quarry, and the temporary line soon once again became permanent. And a second engine joined Fitz in 1900 to help cope with the workload. This was Bagnall's number 1596 and named Salisbury. With the new engine came more wagons, taking the number of rolling stock owned to 43. Time passed and the twin quarries' output peaked by 1906 to almost 70,000 tonnes collectively. But by the beginning of the First World War, the quarry began to show decline. The coffee pots that had served the line faithfully were sold off and gone by 1918, and by 1922 a slack trade forced one of the kilns to close. Salisbury had taken over as the principal locomotive and was awarded with a new boiler in 1927, but by 1933 Hilts could not be expanded any further and both quarries were now running dry. It was decided that the Limeworks business was no longer viable, and with that over 130 years of business, the lines were closed for good. Fitz and Salisbury would remain on the site for the next year, but having failed to find a buyer, both engines were sent for scrap. Anything of value, including the rails and some of the machines, were taken and sold or used in the scrap drive of the Second World War. But a lot of infrastructure remains abandoned. The trackbed and sleepers were still in situ, and the grooves where the rails sat could still be seen. The tunnel remained unsealed and served as a secondary purpose as an air raid shelter for the village. For a time, parts of the lines were swallowed up by development, conservation, and some of the line is now a pathway for the public to enjoy. But what about the tunnel? In the 1970s, a local resident was able to purchase a stretch of land which included part of the trackbed, but the land backed up to the entrance of the tunnel. The landowner didn't own the tunnel directly, but decided to fill up the entire area with soil so that he could build a rockery. The other entrance had been bricked up previously, leaving many thinking that the tunnel was demolished along with the majority of the railway. But the legend of the buried tunnel was almost forgotten and passed into folklore until the new landowner and an archaeologist met in a chance meeting. They discussed what may lay at the end of the garden, and the archaeologists, with the new landowner's permission, got a grant to excavate the site, hoping to find some remnants of the railway. What they found astounded them. The tunnel lay in perfect condition to the point that when they cleared the soil, they could walk in it. Soot still covered the walls, and a solitary stone sleeper was found at the entrance, indicating its past. All along the trackbed were the indents of the rest of the track. It was like it was closed yesterday and in near perfect condition. The only indication that any time had passed was the large thin stalactites that hung from the ceiling from the occasional water that had seeped into the tunnel. Apart from one or two drops, the interior was musty but considerably dry. It appeared that the landowner that had sealed the tunnel had probably done the best thing he could do to preserve it. By covering the entrance in soil, the tunnel was preserved like a time capsule. After looking at the document showing the railway in full swing in 1793, the archaeologists concluded that this beat the record of the oldest railway tunnel in the world by 2 years. The tunnel was documented and pictures and scans taken, but it was ultimately concluded that to preserve it for future generations and to deter anyone trying to get a look, the tunnel would be sealed back up once more, so again it was buried after the works were completed. Today the tunnel is given protected status and has been scheduled as an ancient monument. Even though it's impossible to see, it was and remains an interesting story of the tunnel in the neighbour's backyard.